In the spring of 1962, a man walked into a bank in rural Nebraska, sat down across from one of the most powerful lenders in the county, read 8 pages of fine print that everyone else had ignored for 15 years, and then slid the papers back across the desk. He didn't argue. He didn't curse. He didn't beg for better terms. He just looked the banker dead in the eye and said 2 words that would define the next 4 decades of his life. "No, sir." The banker laughed. His assistant laughed. The whole office laughed. Nobody was laughing in 1984. His name was Walter Greer, 34 years old, 3rd-generation farmer from Millard County, Nebraska. His grandfather had broken ground on that land with nothing but a plow horse and a stubborn heart. Stay with me until the end. Before we begin, please take a moment to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and comment where you're watching from. Now, let's get into it. His father had expanded it during the post-war boom, and Walter had inherited not just the farm, but a set of principles so deeply planted in him that no amount of social pressure or financial temptation could uproot them. He wasn't a complicated man. He woke before sunrise. He worked until his back ached. He came home to a wife who loved him and 3 kids who thought the world of him. He went to church on Sunday, not to be seen, but because he actually believed what was said there. But on this particular Tuesday morning in April 1962, Walter Greer had a problem. His main irrigation pump had failed. The growing season was starting. Without water, he'd lose most of his corn crop. Without the corn crop, he'd lose the year. And with a dry winter already behind him, he couldn't afford to lose the year. He needed $6,000, and he needed it fast. So he put on his good shirt, drove 23 miles into town, and walked through the glass doors of First Continental Savings Bank of Millard County. The man behind the desk was named Gerald Foss. 15 years in banking, silver hair, clean hands, a tie so tight it looked like it was throttling him. He greeted Walter the way a doctor greets a patient he already suspects is a hypochondriac, politely, professionally, and with a faint undercurrent of impatience. "Mr. Greer, what can we do for you today?" Walter explained. "Pump failure. Growing. Season. $6,000. He could repay over 4 years, 7% interest, solid collateral in the land itself. He'd never missed a payment on anything in his life." Gerald Foss nodded slowly, opened his drawer, and produced a contract. 12 pages, single-spaced, legal language so thick you'd need a machete to cut through it. Walter picked it up. He didn't skim it the way most men did, eyes glazed, nodding, flipping to the signature line. He read it. Every sentence, every clause, every asterisk. He read it the way his grandfather had taught him to read anything before he put his name on it. It took nearly 40 minutes. Gerald Foss checked his watch twice. When Walter finally set the contract down, he pointed to a clause on page 5. "What's this right here?" Section 4, subparagraph C. Gerald leaned over and glanced at it without much interest. "That's our rate adjustment clause, standard language. It allows the bank to modify the interest terms based on prevailing market conditions." "Modify it upward?" "In theory, yes, but in practice. So I could sign today at 7%, and 6 months from now you could change it to 14. Gerald smiled the smile of a man who had given this explanation 100 times. "Mr. Greer, we're not in the business of ambushing our customers. That clause exists as a protective measure for the bank during extraordinary..." And this section. Walter flipped to page 9. Section 7. It says the bank can demand full repayment of the outstanding balance if it determines, at its sole discretion, that the loan represents an unacceptable risk. That's also standard language. Who decides what's an unacceptable risk? The bank makes that determination based on a range of, "So you do." Silence. "Let me make sure I'm understanding this correctly," Walter said quietly. "I sign this paper today. I plant my crop. I work all summer. And then, at any point between now and full repayment, you can decide, by yourself with no appeal from me, that you want all your money back immediately. And if I can't produce it in 30 days, you foreclose on land that's been in my family for 60 years, Gerald Foss cleared his throat. "Mr. Greer, those provisions have never been invoked arbitrarily. Every farmer in this county has signed this exact contract." "I understand that." Walter straightened the pages neatly, squared them on the edge of the desk, and slid them back. "I won't be signing it." Gerald stared at him. "I beg your pardon? I'd like the loan. I need the money, and I intend to pay it back, every cent, on time. But I won't sign a contract that gives you the right to change the rules after I've already bet the farm on them." Literally. "Then how exactly would you propose to—" "A handshake." The word landed in the office like a stone dropped in still water. "A handshake," Gerald repeated. $6,000, 7% simple interest, 4-year repayment, no adjustment. Clauses, no acceleration, no fine print. We shake hands on it right now. You get 2 witnesses from your own staff to record the terms, and I'll pay you back exactly what I said I would." Gerald Foss looked at Walter Greer for a long moment. Then he did something that Walter would remember for the rest of his life. He laughed, not a polite chuckle, not a professional smile, a genuine shoulders-shaking, head-thrown-back laugh. He called over his shoulder to the woman at the front desk. "Patrice, come here. You've got to hear this." Patrice appeared in the doorway. Gerald pointed at Walter. "This gentleman wants to borrow $6,000 on a handshake." Patrice blinked. Then she laughed too. Walter sat very still. He let them finish. "Mr. Greer." Gerald wiped his eyes. "This is 1962. Handshake lending went out with the horse and buggy. We have procedures, we have legal departments, we have regulations. I'm sorry, but if you want this loan, you sign the contract. That's how banking works." Walter stood up. He picked up his hat from the chair. "Then I suppose I'll find another way." "You won't find another bank in this county that operates differently." Walter nodded slowly. "Maybe not. But I'll tell you something, Mr. Foss." He paused at the door. "My grandfather used to say that a contract is what 2 men write when they don't trust each other. And if we don't trust each other, then no amount of paper is going to fix that." He walked out. The bell above the door chimed once as it closed. Behind him, Gerald Foss turned back to Patrice. "He'll be back," he said. "They always come back." Walter Greer never came back. Now, to understand why Walter did what he just did, you have to understand where he came from. Not just the farm, not just Millard County. You have to understand a cold evening in the winter of 1934, and an old man named Theodore Greer sitting on a front porch watching the last light die over fields he still owned. Theodore, Walter's grandfather, had homesteaded that land in 1901, built the farmhouse with timber he hauled himself, dug the first well by hand, planted the first crop in ground that had never been turned before. He was not a man who spoke often or smiled easily, but when he did either, it meant something. The 1930s nearly broke everything. The Dust Bowl, the Depression, commodity prices that dropped so low, a man could harvest a full field and still not break even. Theodore watched neighbors, men he'd known for 30 years, lose everything. Farms auctioned off for a fraction of their worth. Families who'd worked the same land for 2 generations, suddenly living in their cars. It wasn't the drought that took them. Theodore understood that much. It was the contracts. Every one of those families had borrowed money during the good years. Every one of them had signed the standard bank contracts, and buried in those contracts, in language that no farmer with a 3rd-grade education could pass, were 2 clauses that proved to be weapons. The first was the rate adjustment clause. When interest rates climbed in the early Depression years, the banks invoked it. Loans that had been manageable at 5% became crushing at 11%. The second was the acceleration clause. If a bank decided a loan was at risk, and in the Depression, all loans were at risk, they could demand full repayment immediately, not at the end of the term, now, 30 days. Pay everything or lose everything. Theodore had no such contracts. He had never believed in them. Every deal he'd ever made, seed credit with the merchant, equipment loans from neighbors, cattle trades at the county fair, everyone had been done the old way. Face to face, witnesses present, terms spoken aloud and recorded in his small black notebook. He kept every notebook in a tin box on the kitchen shelf. He called it his library. When the bank started calling in loans across the county, Theodore's neighbors came to him one by one, desperate, confused, holding contracts they'd signed without reading, full of language they didn't understand, being used against them in ways they never imagined. Theodore helped where he could, but for most of them, it was too late. The paper had already won. One evening in December 1934, Theodore called 10-year-old Walter out to the porch. The temperature had dropped below zero. Snow was coming in from the west in long, slow sheets. Across the road, the Kimball farm, where Walter had spent 100 summer afternoons playing with Jim Kimball, sat dark and empty. The Kimballs had been gone for 2 months. "Look at those fields," Theodore said. Walter looked. "We still own them." "You know why?" Walter shook his head. "Because I never gave anyone a piece of paper that let them take them from me." He pulled his coat tighter. "A handshake is between two men who trust each other. A contract is between two men who don't. And it's written by the one with the better lawyer. Remember that, boy. When someone needs 20 pages of legal language to make a simple deal, that's not business. That's a trap." Walter never forgot. He carried that lesson through school, through 2 years in the army, through his marriage to a woman named Ruth, through the early years of building the farm back up after his father's death. When the time came to borrow money, he borrowed it the way his grandfather always had, on his word, in front of witnesses, written down in a plain black composition notebook, the same kind Theodore had used. And so, when Gerald Foss slid that 12-page contract across the desk in April 1962, Walter read every line of it, not because he was suspicious of Gerald personally. He read it because his grandfather had shown him exactly what those clauses could do. He walked out of that bank and didn't look back. Now here's the thing people always ask when they hear this story. If he didn't get the bank loan, how did he fix the pump? The answer is both simple and telling. He drove out to see a man named Carl Holt. Carl was 67 years old, semi-retired, and owned more farmland in Millard County than anyone except the state government. He'd also grown up doing business the same way Theodore Greer had, on a handshake with witnesses and a notebook. Walter sat at Carl's kitchen table, explained the situation, and asked for a private loan. $6,000. 7%. 4 years. Carl poured 2 cups of coffee, listened without interrupting, and when Walter was done, he said, "I know your family. Your grandfather was as honest a man as I ever met. You got witnesses?" "My neighbor, Dale Parson. He drove me over." Carl called his wife Ruth in from the garden. She stood at the counter, witness to everything. Walter read the terms aloud. Carl confirmed them. Walter wrote them in his notebook. Carl and both Ruths signed. They shook hands. The whole process took 11 minutes. Walter had his money before lunch. He had his new pump installed by Thursday. His corn crop that year was the best he'd ever grown. He paid Carl Holt back 18 months early. Over the next 2 decades, Walter Greer built a reputation in Millard County that was unusual to say the least. He never signed a contract. Not for equipment loans, not for seed credit, not for anything. He did every piece of business on a handshake, with witnesses recorded in those black notebooks. The jokes started almost immediately. "Handshake Walter," they called him. Dealers laughed at him. Suppliers turned him away. There were years where he couldn't buy equipment because no dealer would accept his terms, and he couldn't find a private seller with what he needed. He adapted. He bought older equipment and maintained it obsessively. He built supply relationships with older farmers who remembered the old ways. He was slower to grow than his neighbors, more limited in his options. He accepted that. Every time he thought about giving in, about just signing one contract this one time for this one thing, he thought about the Kimball farm sitting dark and empty across the road in 1934, and he kept his pen in his pocket. By 1984, Walter had filled 9 notebooks. 22 years of handshake deals. Every transaction documented, witnessed, and signed in that careful, unhurried script his grandfather had used. His wife Ruth kept them in a fireproof lockbox under the kitchen sink. "You're going to need those." "Someday," she told him more than once. "They're just records," Walter would say. "They're your life's work," she'd answer. "Every promise you ever made and kept." She was right. She just didn't know yet how completely, devastatingly right she was. Because 1984 was coming. And when it arrived like a storm that had been building for 20 years, and every single farmer in Millard County who had ever signed One of Gerald Foss's standard contracts was about to find out what those adjustment clauses and acceleration clauses actually meant. Every one of them, that is, except Walter Greer. The man they'd laughed at for 22 years was about to become the only man in the county who didn't have to be afraid. The 1984 farm crisis didn't arrive as a single catastrophe. It crept in the way bad winters do. First a cold snap, then a harder freeze, then one morning you wake up and everything is solid to the bone. It had started years earlier, really. In the mid-1970s, the US government had pushed American farmers to expand. Plant to fence-a-row, the Secretary of Agriculture had said. Grain exports were surging, land prices were climbing. Borrow and grow, that was the message. And Nebraska farmers had heard it and believed it. They borrowed. They signed the contracts. They expanded. They planted fence-a-row to fence-a-row. Then the export markets collapsed. Commodity prices fell off a cliff. The Federal Reserve raised interest rates to historic highs to fight inflation, and those rate adjustment clauses that farmers had signed without fully reading, they activated. Loans that had been manageable at 8% were suddenly recalculated at 16, 17, 18%. And the land values that had justified all the borrowing, they dropped 30, 40, 50% in some areas. By the spring of 1984, there were farmers in Millard County who owed more on their land than the land was worth, and whose interest payments had doubled or tripled because of clauses buried in contracts they'd signed a decade earlier. The bank didn't wait around to see if anyone could recover. Gerald Foss had retired in 1981. His replacement was a man named Thomas Buckley, brought in from Lincoln, 38 years old, sharp-eyed and carrying a mandate from the bank's parent company to optimize the loan portfolio. In plain language, that meant get the money back. Buckley went through every agricultural account in the county. He invoked the acceleration clause on any loan he judged to be at risk. In the spring and summer of 1984, foreclosure notices went out to 31 farming families in Millard County. The county newspaper ran them on page 3, week after week. Walter's wife Ruth would sit at the kitchen table reading the names aloud. People they'd known for 20 years, people whose children had gone to school with their children. The Hendersons, she'd say. Lord have mercy. They've been on that land since 1919. Walter would nod and say nothing. There was nothing to say. The paper had spoken. The clause had activated. The trap had closed. And then, on a Wednesday morning in late June, a letter arrived at the Greer farm. Walter opened it at the kitchen table, Ruth across from him with her coffee, the morning sunlight falling across the worn pine surface. He read it once. Then he read it again. Then he started to laugh. Ruth looked at him the way a woman looks at a man she's been married to for 26 years who has just started laughing at a foreclosure notice. Walter. What on earth? He turned the letter around and slid it across to her. Dear Mr. Greer, your loan of $6,000 originated in 1969 is hereby called in full per section 7, subparagraph C of your signed loan agreement. The current outstanding balance, including adjusted interest and applicable fees, is $11,340. Payment is due within 30 days. They think I signed a contract, Walter said. Ruth read the letter again. But you didn't. I did not. That loan was with Frank Alderman, 1969. Dale Parson and Gene Whitmore witnessed it. It's in the 7th notebook. Walter was already getting up from the table, moving toward the kitchen cabinet where Ruth kept the lockbox. 7% simple interest, 5-year term, no clauses, no fine print. He pulled out the notebook, flipped to the right page, and set it down in front of her. I paid it off in 4 years. I still have receipts. Ruth looked at the neat handwriting. Below Walter's entry, in slightly shakier hands, were the signatures of Dale Parson and Gene Whitmore. So they have no loan agreement. They have a record in their system showing a loan was made. Whoever entered it assumed there was a contract. There wasn't. Walter put on his reading glasses and looked at the letter again. They can't foreclose. On a handshake. There's no contract to invoke, no collateral agreement, no acceleration clause. They gave me money based on my word, and I paid it back. That's it. What are you going to do? Walter folded the letter carefully along its original creases and set it down on top of the notebook. "I'm going to put on my Sunday clothes," he said, "and go explain this to Mr. Buckley." Walter walked into First Continental Savings Bank of Millard County on a Thursday morning wearing a jacket that still smelled faintly of cedar from the closet. He carried the black notebook under his arm and Ruth's tin lockbox in his left hand. The secretary looked up when he came in. Most farmers who'd received foreclosure notices didn't walk through the bank's front door looking calm. They came in, desperate, pleading, begging for extensions. Sometimes they didn't come in at all, they just ran, hoping to delay the inevitable. Walter asked for Thomas Buckley. Buckley received him in the back office with the professional courtesy of a man who expects to be in control of the conversation. He offered coffee. Walter declined. "I received your letter," Walter said. "Good. I assume you've had time to—" "I need you to show me the contract." Buckley paused. "I beg your pardon?" "The loan agreement you're citing in your letter. Section 7, sub-paragraph C. I'd like to see the original document I signed." Buckley opened the file folder on his desk. It was thick. Account statements, internal memos, interest calculations going back 15 years. He flipped through it with the focused efficiency of a man who did this every day. He flipped a second time, a third time, slower. "It should be in here," he said, more to himself than to Walter. "The original agreement, with your signature—" "It's not there, Mr. Buckley." Walter's voice was even. Not triumphant, not angry, just stating a fact. "It doesn't exist. Because—" "I never signed one." Buckley looked up. "That's not possible. The loan is in our system. It has an origination date, a principal amount, an interest rate, all of which match the deal I made with Frank Alderman in 1969. Walter opened the notebook on the desk. July 8, 1969, $6,000, 7% simple interest. 5-year repayment term, witnessed by Dale Parson and Jean Whitmore, both residents of Millard County, both alive, both willing to testify to the exact terms of that agreement. He turned the notebook so Buckley could read the signatures. "I paid the loan in full 4 years later. I have receipts." The color was starting to drain from Buckley's face, but he wasn't ready to concede. "Mr. Greer, even if no formal contract was signed at origination, the bank's position is that any loan of this size requires what? A piece of paper you can use to change the terms after the fact?" Walter kept his voice measured, almost gentle. "Mr. Buckley, I'm not here to fight with you. I'm here to explain a straightforward situation. You have no signed contract. You have no rate adjustment clause that applies to me. You have no legal basis to invoke an acceleration provision that I never agreed to." He paused. "And if you proceed with foreclosure proceedings, I will appear in court with this notebook, those 2 witnesses, a very clear paper trail of every payment I made, and a judge who is going to be very interested in the fact that your bank attempted to foreclose on a man using a contract he never signed." Buckley was quiet for a long moment. "What exactly are you proposing?" "I'm not proposing anything. I'm informing you. The 1969 loan is paid. The debt is settled. This letter—" Walter picked it up from the desk and held it briefly between his fingers before setting it back down. "Is based on a mistake. I'm giving you the opportunity to correct it quietly." Another silence, longer this time. "I'll need to consult with our legal department." "Of course." Walter stood and gathered his notebook. "I'll show myself out." He was almost at the door when Buckley said, almost involuntarily, "How long have you been doing business this way?" Walter turned. "Since 1962. "Without a single signed contract?" "Not one." Buckley looked at the empty loan file, at the foreclosure letter that had no legal foundation, at the notebook in Walter's hands that contained 22 years of handshake deals, all witnessed, all recorded, all paid. "Gerald Foss told me about you," he said quietly. "He thought you were crazy." Walter smiled for the first time since he'd walked in. "I remember, he laughed pretty hard that day." He walked out of the bank, down the 3 concrete steps, across the parking lot, and into the same truck he'd been driving for 11 years. He sat there for a moment with the engine off. Then he drove home. The bank's lawyers didn't fold immediately. They never do. They spent 3 weeks searching for any shred of documentation that might support their position. Any note, any internal memo, any scrap of paper with Walter Greer's name on it that could be construed as an agreement to their standard terms. They found nothing, because there was nothing to find. In September 1984, First Continental Savings Bank of Millard County officially withdrew the foreclosure notice on the Greer property. The reason given in their internal records, discovered years later through a Freedom of Information request, was 3 words: no signed contract. But the story didn't end there, because when Walter's neighbors heard what had happened, when word spread through Millard County that Handshake Walter had faced down a foreclosure notice and won, the questions started coming. People began looking more carefully at their own contracts. Farmers who were already in foreclosure proceedings hired lawyers for the first time and said, "Look at this. Is this clause actually enforceable? Did we really agree to this?" Some found that the clauses, while legal, had been misapplied. Some found errors in the interest calculations. Some found procedural violations in the foreclosure process itself. It wasn't a revolution. Most of the foreclosures went through. The farm crisis was real, and no amount of legal scrutiny could undo the economic mathematics that had destroyed so many families. But a few farms were saved, and every one of those savings traced back, in some way, to the conversation that spread through the county in the fall of 1984. You hear what happened with Handshake Walter? You hear what he showed them? Walter Greer farmed his land until he was 78 years old. He never signed a contract. When younger farmers came to ask him about his system, he would sit them down at that same kitchen table, pour coffee, and walk them through the notebooks, all 11 of them by the time he was done. He didn't tell people not to sign contracts. He wasn't a preacher. He would just say, "Read it, every word. If you can't understand it, find someone who can. And if they can't explain it to you in plain language, ask yourself what they're hiding in all those words." His son Marcus took over the farm in 2001. The first thing Walter did on the day of the transfer was take the tin lockbox out from under the kitchen sink and set it on the table. 11 notebooks, Walter said. 40 years. Every deal I ever made. Marcus looked at them. "What do I do with these?" "Keep them. Add to them." Walter tapped the most recent one. "This is your inheritance as much as the land. It's proof that a man can live in this world and do business honestly, without tricks, without traps, without fine print he doesn't mean." He looked out the kitchen window at the fields, the same fields Theodore had broken ground on in 1901, the same fields that had survived the Depression and the Dust Bowl and the farm crisis of 1984. Every one of those deals was made between people who trusted each other enough to look each other in the eye. That's worth more than any piece of paper. Walter Greer died in 2009 at the age of 81. The obituary in the Millard County Gazette mentioned his farming record, his family, his church membership. But the sentence that people cut out and kept, the one that got passed around, taped, to refrigerators, read at the County Farm Bureau meeting the following spring, was the last one. It read, "He shook hands with everyone he ever did business with, and not one of them ever said he let them down." The farm is still there, the lockbox is still in the kitchen, and somewhere in Millard County right now, there is a man who grew up hearing this story, who sat at that kitchen table and heard Walter explain the notebooks, who understood for the E. First time that the world works differently for people who refuse to be trapped by their own signature. In 1962, Gerald Foss laughed at Walter Greer and said he'd never succeed without signing a contract. 22 years later, the bank came to foreclose and found nothing to hold on to. That's the power of knowing what you're agreeing to. That's the legacy of a man who said no. That's what a handshake is worth, when the man behind it never breaks his word.